Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started because we want to be respectful of everyone's time. We will have a few more people joining. Thank you for being here on this Thursday morning. My name is Abigail Madden. I am the Associate Program Officer for the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation, and I help support the Artistic Vitality Program here in Chicago. We're excited today to have arts leaders from both of the geographic regions that the Donnelly Foundation supports. So welcome to our leaders from Chicago, and also welcome to arts leaders from the Low Country. And Chicago folks, if you are unfamiliar with Low Country, the Low Country is a geographic and cultural region along South Carolina's southern coast that extends from Georgetown through Charleston, down to Beaufort, almost down to the Georgia border. And the foundation supports efforts in the arts, land conservation, and collections in both regions. So thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. Before I get started, I just want to say, and I see now, I was just going to introduce Jamie Camasso from SignNexus, who is doing our captioning today. And Jamie has just added in the chat the way that you can access our captions. So thank you, Jamie. And if you all have any trouble accessing those captions or have any questions about it, don't hesitate to send me a message in the chat, or you can also reach out to Kyle Hammond, who is our technical guru today. So thank you, Kyle, for being here to help us. I'm going to be passing the mic over to our guest speaker today shortly, but before I do, I just want to take care of a few things on the front end. So as you may have noticed when you joined, we are recording this session. We are going to be posting the session after it's done on our YouTube channel, so people that are unable to join us today will be able to see it. We do ask you for now to keep your cameras off and that you stay muted during the presentation. We are going to be having a Q&A portion in a little bit after Christena speaks. And so we will encourage you to turn on, and we really want to have it be a casual conversation, and we're excited to see your faces in a little bit. But please don't hesitate to do what you have to do. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out via chat. As I mentioned, we do have Kyle Hammond of KBH Media on the back end helping, so you can also message him as well. As I said, my name is Abigail Madden. I want to give a short physical description of myself. I am a 40-something white woman with reddish hair. I'm wearing a black top with a gray sweater, and I'm coming to you from the Foundation's Chicago office today. A short land acknowledgement from Chicago is that Chicago is located on the ancestral homes of the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Odawa. As an important land and water crossroads, many other Native communities lived and traded here and called it home. And Chicago is one of the original 5 cities designated in the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. Today, the region is home to the 3rd largest urban Native American population in the US, with members representing numerous tribal communities. And again, I just want to say thank you to both regions for being here. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Christena because we're really excited to have her here today. We've been working with Christena for the past couple years on these various trainings, and you can see some of the other trainings that she's done for us on the Donnelly Foundation's YouTube channel. But Christena is, let me just give a short bio. So bringing Chicago together around the intersection of disability and the arts was Christena's main aim as she started Cultural Access Collaborative, or COLLAB, in 2013. Having over 15 years of experience in cultural accessibility from a variety of cultural organizations, including the Metropolitan Museum and Lincoln Center, she currently serves as the Assistant Director of Disability Services at Adler University, and she is the founder and president of the COLLAB. Thanks to her brother, who has Down syndrome, cultural accessibility became her passion as they visited museums and attended plays together. Christena speaks internationally about cultural accessibility and especially about the importance of establishing a local access knowledge network in one's own community. So with that, I'm going to be turning it over to Christena. She's going to present a little bit. She's also going to bring in a guest speaker that she'll introduce. And at the end, as I mentioned, we'll be opening it up for some questions and answers. So without further ado, I am so excited to introduce Christena Gunther. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Abby. It's great to be here. I'm going to start to share screen, which always is, I feel like it's like parallel parking, hard to do when other people are watching, but let's see if I got it. All right. Hopefully that works for everybody. It's so good to see. Well, I will get to see you, but good to see your names right now. I'll do a brief visual description first. I am a white woman in my late 30s. I have dark hair that's pulled back into a ponytail. I'm sitting with the window behind me and I have a black shirt on. So for today, we're going to be focusing on accessibility for audiences with physical or mobility disabilities. My pronouns are she, her, and I am here today as an accessibility consultant, but always lurking in the background is Cultural Access Collaborative, which is really my passion project, like Abby mentioned. And you're always welcome to email me. I love to get emails, actually. So you're welcome to email me at cgunther, that's CGUNTHER, at culturalaccesscollab.org. And you'll notice as I'm going through this whole presentation, I'm going to be trying to model accessibility as I go, of course. And one of the ways that I'm going to do that is try to read everything that's on the slide and not just assume that you all can see it. So a little bit about the Cultural Access Collaborative before we get started. I know we have some Chicago folks in the house, which is great to see. And I also welcome to the Low Country folks. For those of you in Chicago or in Illinois, especially I want to make sure if you're not already familiar, you are familiar with the COLLAB, Cultural Access Collaborative. We used to be called CCAC, Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium. And we changed our name this year on our 10th anniversary. So we are primarily a volunteer-run nonprofit, and our mission, which has changed recently, is to empower Illinois, not just Chicago, but all of Illinois' cultural spaces to become more accessible to visitors with disabilities. And so we do that really in three primary ways, which is professional development workshops. So kind of like this today, we do different trainings and different workshops to talk about access related issues in cultural spaces. We provide for the Chicago region a free accessible equipment loan program. So we'll loan out different types of equipment to help make captioning, assistive listening devices, different pieces like that possible for you, especially those of you in smaller spaces. So that's a really awesome opportunity that way. And then also we manage an access calendar that lists accessible offerings happening in Illinois and virtually anywhere that are accessible to people with disabilities. So you're welcome to email me at the email address I shared at the beginning if you want to join our listserv and you want to learn especially about future professional development workshops. Thanks to COVID, we primarily are doing a lot of virtual things. So even in the Low Country, you're welcome to join too. So feel free to email me if you'd like. So as Abby mentioned at the beginning, I have a brother named Travis who has Down syndrome. I'm sharing a photo of him here. I like to say that I am contractually obligated as being a big sister to share a picture of my brother. He's asked that I talk about him in any presentation that I give, which I will happily do. I'm sharing a photo of Travis that's from when we visited the Ringling Museum in Florida a few years ago. And Travis is seated. He's a white man with Down syndrome. He's waving and holding my purse that's full of stuff. But what's significant about this picture for me, and especially for our topic today, is that he's sitting in a wheelchair. So whenever we go to museums, for the most part, because my brother struggles with some mobility issues just connected to Down syndrome, he has difficulty walking long distances. And so usually when we go to a museum, especially a larger museum, we always will borrow a wheelchair to make it easier for him. So that way he's able to enjoy the museum and not worry about when he's going to find a seat or any pain he might have in his knees or his back. So this is an example of maybe a disability that you haven't thought of that might be affected. It might be kind of part of this mobility disability category. So we're going to just start with some basic terms. We probably, if you've been at any other trainings I've done, have heard me say this already, recycled these slides many times, but I think it's important for us all to be on the same page about what we're talking about today. So first of all, what is disability? There are a lot of different definitions. I think a good place to start, especially in America, is with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990. So that definition is someone who has a record of or is regarded as having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And that could be defined as eating, breathing, walking, talking, seeing, lots of different things. You'll notice that the definition of disability is not just a list of diagnoses, but rather talking about how whatever you live with might impact how you go into the world, basically. So that definition is a legal definition, which of course is important to know, but I think for our purposes, it's better to think a little more holistically about what disability is and kind of get out of the legal realm a little bit too. So this is from the NORA Project, which is a really awesome nonprofit that's based here in Chicago that's especially focused on education for students with disabilities. And so the NORA Project says disability is a difference in the way a person moves, communicates, feels, and/or processes information. It's a difference in the way they complete the tasks of daily life. And this is my favorite part about the definition. There's nothing good or bad about disability. It's a form of human diversity. I think that's really important for us to carry with us today, especially when we're talking about physical disabilities or mobility disabilities. There's a lot of interesting things that get projected onto that type of disability. I think a lot of like fear, pity, different things like that. But it's important to remember since the beginning of time, disability has existed. Difference is inherent in all humans. And so we just need to accept that. And then we can move on and hopefully design things with everyone in mind. So just to reiterate, again, disability is a normal part of the human experience. It is something we should be planning for and something we should expect. So another thing that I always talk about when I do these types of trainings, but again, is helpful for us to focus, and especially when we're talking about physical disabilities, is the medical model, which is still used obviously in medicine, I think today, but you'll still find it if you watch a news story or read a newspaper article too. So the medical model, which is illustrated on the left, says the issue is the individual. There's a circle, and then there's arrows pointing into the circle. So the medical model is really saying the problem, disability is a problem, and it is a problem that you as an individual need to find a cure for. You need to, learn how to walk. You need to try to become, quote unquote, as normal as possible, and so that you can go about your life. The social model of disability, which increasingly is how many people view disability, is kind of the opposite. So it says the issue is an inaccessible world. We have a circle and then arrows emanating out from the circle. So this is really reframing what disability is as not, one, it isn't a problem, but two, if there is a problem, the problem is the barriers that exist in the systems that we create. So I like to think about the Metropolitan Museum of Art as an example. So I used to work there. I'm guessing many of you have been there or are familiar with what it looks like, but it is a beautiful Beaux-Arts building. It has a huge stairway that leads up to the main entrance. And, you know, wonderful building, very classic. Lots of people have lunch on the steps. It's a lovely space. But if you are a wheelchair user and you are trying to get into the museum, those steps are a huge barrier. And the problem is not that you are a wheelchair user. The problem is that the museum decided to build those steps. And so we as institutions, we as systems, we with whatever sphere of control and power we have, we need to be removing those barriers so that everyone can participate. It's not the individual's fault that they are how they are. It's rather that we as a society, we're not considering them in the first place. So that's really what the social model is thinking about. So this is what we need to carry with us as we go into our cultural spaces, to realize there are barriers consciously or unconsciously that were put into place that are preventing people from coming to our spaces and participating in our events. And so we need to try to remove those. And there's going to be lots of them, and you know, we can remove them one at a time, but we need to be working on dismantling them, just as we would any other ism that we might be focusing on. So some fun disability fast facts. So just kind of going over some basics, which I think especially these types of facts are really helpful for you to take with you to meetings when you're talking with your leadership or, you know, considering disability and accessibility in general. So first of all is just that nearly 1 in 4 Americans has some type of disability. So 25% of the American population has some type of disability. I and many other people believe it to be even higher than that, but 1 in 4 people has this. So we, again, should be planning for and expecting that guests with disabilities will be coming to our spaces rather than being surprised that it happens, because it is such a huge number of people that we're talking about. And then we also need to acknowledge that as we age, this percentage is going to grow. And so as baby boomers, for instance, continue to age, likely they're going to be acquiring additional disabilities. I think we all know this for ourselves or for loved ones that we might have as they get older. We do expect to acquire different disabilities, and often those disabilities will impact mobility. Another thing that's important to understand is intersectionality, is understanding that disability impacts any marginalized community we might be talking about. Disability is so accessible, it's going to affect all of us at some point, probably. So African Americans are more likely than non-Hispanic whites to have a disability in every age group. I'm guessing your cultural organization, like many others, especially since the murder of George Floyd in 2020, has placed an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion work, which is so important, and trying to become anti-racist organizations, which we all need to strive to do. But if we're going to try to do that, we also need to acknowledge, we also want to make sure that guests, regardless of their racial, ethnic background or any other background, may have a disability as well. So again, being accessible is also going to aid our anti-racist work, for instance. Another thing that's important to know is that any one of us may join the disability community at any time, temporarily or permanently. There's a great quote that says the difference between a person with a disability and without is 5 seconds. So through accident, through illness, through lots of different factors, aging, we may become disabled temporarily, maybe with a broken bone, or permanently. This is also something that's close to home for me. When I started doing this work, I cared very strongly about supporting people with disabilities, thanks to my brother, but I did not have a disability myself. But 3 years ago, I acquired a disability. I have post-concussion syndrome. So I'm now a part of this community, and it's unclear if that will be for forever or if that will just be temporary. And well, at some point I will get over those symptoms, but any one of us can join at any time, this community. Another thing to know, I think we have heard this a lot at this point, but it's important to acknowledge many disabilities are invisible. So if you see my brother and me, you might think there's only one disabled sibling, but in fact, there are 2. I don't present as a person with a disability, but I do live with one. And so this is really important for us as we look at and survey the guests that we have coming to our spaces, we're not going to know necessarily what supports they're going to need. And that's where it's so important. We are making it front and center so people know where to go if they need help or they need support or need to know what is accessible, because we need to be able to have a conversation with them, possibly for them to let us know what they might need. And many people have multiple disabilities, especially as we age, but many people live with multiple different types of conditions and diagnoses. And so it's easy sometimes to break disability down into different categories. And that's what we've done, even for these trainings for the Donnelly Foundation. However, like anything, it's not as clear cut as that. And so there could be somebody who's blind, deaf, and a wheelchair user. And so they're going to require a variety of different supports that a wheelchair user alone might not need. And so we also need to understand that piece as well. And finally, all disabilities exist on a spectrum. So this great quote, if you've met a person with a disability, then you've met one person with a disability. So that's important to keep in mind as well as we go through this work. There are definitely some similarities when we think about kind of these groups in aggregate. However, what an individual is going to need is going to vary on so many different factors. And so that's where, again, we want to try to be as accessible as possible by having some good systems and plans in place. But at the same time, we're still going to need to have an interactive process at times to adapt or make changes for individual guests, depending on what they might need. Another good definition to make sure that we're addressing is really to put a name to this ism, as I've been talking about a little bit earlier. So what is ableism? So ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. This is a great quote that's by Talila Lewis and Dustin Gibson, part of the Harriet Tubman Collective. And I really encourage you, as you go back to your organizations after this training, to really look at, what values and ideas you or your organization might hold about what's normal, quote unquote, that may unconsciously perpetuate ableist attitudes. And so as we think about physical disabilities today, I'm guessing an example of ableism in your organization, just a guess, would be that the typical guest is going to be someone ambulatory, someone who's able to walk. It's probably what we think of when we think of our guests. However, that is not necessarily the case. And so we need to kind of be reframing constantly what we're thinking about, like a typical visitor might look like and might need, and realize that a lot of that is assuming that they don't have a disability, when in fact, we know it's likely that they do. So this is kind of a good reminder as we go forward. Museum and theater staff, all of you all, will likely encounter disabled people at every event, at every performance, or every tour that you have each day. And also to acknowledge many of us in this cultural administrative role might also have a disability too. And so we should not be making assumptions about, who is or isn't a part of our organization as we go forward. So that is kind of the basic definition. So we're all hopefully now on the same page, and then we can talk more about physical accessibility. And so to do that, first, we're really lucky to have Bri Beck here, who's going to share a little bit about her experiences. Bri, are you here?
Yes, I am here. I was just making sure that my video worked now. Awesome.
Great. It's great to see you. Thanks for coming today.
Of course. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
So, you can see all the questions that I'm going to be asking Bri, but let's start with the kind of, which I think is probably the hardest question. Tell us more about yourself.
Right. This is always the question that's like, okay, how do I give like an elevator pitch about who I am? But hey, everybody, my name is Bri, and I currently live in Chicago. And funny enough, I actually used to live in the Low Country. So it's funny, this connection here. I lived in Charleston, South Carolina from, 2013 to 2016. So I was down there for a little bit after college. I lived downtown and I worked in Mount Pleasant, for all of you that are in that area right now. So currently I live in Chicago, and I've lived here for about 7 years. I am a practicing art therapist. So I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor, an art therapist. I'm also an artist and am very involved in the disability arts and culture and advocacy community here in Chicago. I also work part-time at an organization called Access Living, and I do disability arts-based cultural events. We do some peer support programming there. And with that, I also identify as disabled. So I guess that leads into the next question, if you want me to go ahead.
Sure. I forgot to ask you to do a visual description of yourself.
Oh, yes, I should be doing that. I am a white woman in my early 30s. I've got brown hair and blue eyes. I'm wearing like some cat eye shaped glasses. I'm wearing a white shirt, black headphones over my ears, and behind me I'm in my kind of office space, and I've got an easel and some paint supplies and books in the background.
You have an awesome background. It really sums you up, I feel like.
Thank you. You should see on either side of it. It's pretty messy. So thank you for that.
You've chosen a good view. So well done. So would you mind sharing a little bit more about your disability, and especially thinking about how that impacts you when you're visiting a cultural space?
Definitely. So my disability is a form of dwarfism. So I live with a condition called pseudoachondroplasia, and it is a skeletal condition that impacts most of my bones. So arms, legs, all joints, spine. So essentially I'm a person of short stature. I have difficulty walking long distances. And I utilize a mobility scooter to go from place to place. So I guess I could be considered like an semi-ambulatory wheelchair user. So I can get off and on my scooter, go up a step or two. However, that often means I have to lift my scooter up certain steps, and that's always a bit of a challenge. So living, like similar to some of the things that Christina talked about with her brother, Travis, simple things that may not impact a lot of ambulatory folks that are able to walk really do impact me. For instance, huge steps going up to the entrance of a museum, such as the museum Christina described. I think some of the things that can be really challenging are, viewing crowds. For me, it's hard for me to see over large crowds of people standing at concerts. Even if I have an accessible seat, oftentimes the standing will really block my view. It can be hard for me to view art in galleries because of the height that it's hung at. About 5 foot is about the average midpoint that art is hung for an average height person. So I don't always get the full view of what art is supposed to look like. Sometimes I can't even see the description of the art on the wall. And as an artist and as somebody that navigates a lot of just artistic spaces and lives in an urban environment, that can be really challenging. It's also really frustrating when there's things like, oh, the elevator that I need to use is up 3 stairs. And a lot of buildings are designed with just these really strange afterthoughts is what it can seem like, or back entrances to spaces, and can make me feel very, very not thought of, or have to go a very long route to get to a place in the museum. I'm thinking about the Art Institute. There's an area in the Art Institute where you have to like go to a weird hallway in order to get up to the main floor. And it's like an elevator ride to go up a half flight of stairs, and then you have to exit that elevator and go down a ramp and then go up another elevator, like 2 floors. And it's all very hidden. The signage isn't really clear. I've been in spaces where elevators have broken down, and I've been stuck on floors like up on like 2nd or 3rd floor and couldn't get down to the lobby for a long time. So just, there's a lot of barriers that can occur. And I also want to name that, I think physical accessibility is something that's talked about probably most when it comes to access. So I know some of these things might be a little more obvious because they're structural and they're in the built environment. So I also want to name that there are some things that I'm sure I'm going to be missing that other folks with disabilities also experience that that I do not. So I'll speak to what I can in this way.
Thanks, Bri. Can you tell us a little bit about what advanced prep work you have to do before choosing to come to an event or choosing to go to a cultural space?
Yeah, a lot of what I do is just researching, like, thank goodness for the internet. We can look up a lot of things in advance. Like I do a lot of Google Maps. So I will put in an address of a space and kind of look at the photos of the outside of the space and be like, oh, is there a step up to the door? And oftentimes I can tell that from a street view. If there's any sort of information on a cultural space's website about access, I like to see if that's there. But a lot of it is, just looking it up for myself or asking people. I've called places before. I have my friend's having a birthday tomorrow and she's having us go get drinks at this bar. And I was like, that sounds like it's like a downstairs bar. And I was like, is there an elevator down there? And then, my friend had to then call the bar and make sure that that was the case. And so just a lot of like researching that goes into it up front.
Right. And compared to somebody like me who doesn't have a physical disability, I could just up and decide to go basically anywhere I want without really needing to research anything. And so by comparison, you're saying you're doing a lot of advanced like Googling and deep diving to make sure you can go to that space or asking more questions so you can find out more info. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. And knowing like thinking about who's coming with me too. If I know that the space is inaccessible, I might make sure that I have a friend with me or bring my husband with me, and make sure that we talk about those things in advance. Are you okay with carrying my scooter down a set of stairs? Like, are you up for that tonight? And that can feel like a lot to ask sometimes. So really weighing
it can
that.
Feel like a burden that
that
someone like me doesn't have to worry about. Can you tell us a little bit, you mentioned, being stuck in elevators or different things like that, but could you share a couple of anecdotes of some accessibility misses, quote unquote, that you've experienced at different cultural events and how that impacted you or the people you were with?
Yeah, definitely. There's just been, I think there's a couple examples I'll share. I went to this, again, it was like a bar a couple of weeks ago, and there was a sign on the door that said, and I think they were trying to be really great about, making sure people felt welcome in the space. So the sign on the door was like, no ableism, no homophobia, no racism, basically saying like, this is an inclusive, welcoming space. However, when we got to the bar, there was a massive step up to the front door. And then right behind that door, there was another big step up to get into the bar. So I think it's interesting when spaces like think about being equitable and inclusive, but I think disability can often be like not thought of in those categories. And I do want to name that was a small business, and sometimes that's not always possible to like have the proper access. A lot of buildings and retail spaces in Chicago are old, and there's architecture and there's a lot of just stairs. But I do think in examples like that is when it can be really hurtful when you expect for something to be inclusive, and for it to not be. And I think that's just more of like an emotional experience that can occur. So there's a lot of emotional things that happen in the world where like you expect for something to be a good time, and then there's like a disappointment or feeling like you just weren't considered, or that, I think when confronted with that, businesses often get really frozen and feel guilty, and they don't know how to move forward with it. So that's an example of something that happened recently. I also went to Soldier Field recently here in Chicago, which is where the Bears play. And I went to see the Beyonce Renaissance tour, which was incredible. But our experience there, myself and my best friend, we had a really difficult time because nobody that worked at the venue seemed to be informed at all of what the ADA just parameters of the building were. nobody knew where the correct gate was for us to go in that would bring us to the elevator. When we finally did find the right section of the stadium to go in, we had to go up 6 stairs in order to get to the elevator that we needed to take to get to the ADA section of the stadium. When we got to the ADA section, there were people that did not have ADA tickets sitting in the seats because they thought that they were just available for anybody to sit in, because there's often this feeling that this sentiment that I get that a lot of folks don't think that people with disabilities actually exist. Like it's these things like parking spaces are just there just in case, or ADA sections are there just in case, but most likely they're not going to be fully used. So we'll just park here. We'll just sit here. And if anybody comes, then we'll move. So when we arrived in our seats, they were taken. There were chairs that were, it's hard to describe, but that were in other parts of the ADA section that were actually like folded up like metal chairs, and they were locked to the railing with like a bike lock. So, and there was nobody around to assist or help us actually get to where we needed to be and sit down. And we almost missed part of the show. And it just caused so much extra stress and tension, not to mention just like crowds and, folks not knowing how to respond to somebody like me who is lower to the ground in a mobility aid, not even seeing me there. And again, like some of those things are not necessarily the particular fault of any individual. It's just, I think it's a societal issue that it's just like, we're not thinking about this very much. So I'd say those are some big misses that happened very recently.
Thanks for sharing that. I'm sorry that you went through that. I can even hear in your voice that, it was, I'm sure you paid a lot of money and we're very excited to see the Beyonce concert, especially to then kind of have these like series of like fails over and over again, just really takes its toll, I would think. And what you're sharing, what especially stands out to me, obviously there were some architectural issues with like these steps leading up to the elevator, which would have been really helpful to know in advance, I would think. But also a lot of it seems like it comes down to staffing and training, right? That yes. Like nobody knew where anything was when it came to accessibility. There wasn't anyone staffing that accessible section where you were seated, which I think could have addressed a lot of those other issues that you had, would have kept those people without those accessible tickets from sitting in the seats, and moving those chairs that you mentioned and making sure that you had everything that you needed. So to me, I feel like the kind of takeaway of like what we could work to make it better easily would have been through staffing and through training. Is that fair to say?
Totally. And I think that even like leads down to the next question about accessibility wins, because that has been the best experience, is when I, can go to a space and there's somebody there that's like, oh, hey, we got you, like we've been expecting you. We have, even if it's not built into the environment, they're like, follow me, like we'll go to this ramp, or I'm going to help you like get through this hallway. I'm going to like part the sea of people and help you get through, like somebody that's there as an advocate, whose job it is, and it may not be their only job, but they've been informed and trained to assist, because they're recognizing that they have, there might be areas of the venue or space that are really difficult to navigate for somebody that uses a wheelchair or has other accessibility needs. So yeah, just arriving at a place where you know that you've been expected and anticipated can make a huge difference. Universal design. I know it's not always possible to have complete universal design where every body and mind are considered in the design, but when ramps are built in and it's just something that everybody has to use, there's like a long winding walkway going up to an entrance versus a set of stairs. And it just, to feel like I'm just included in that, and it doesn't have to be this afterthought or this other way, this alternative way that I have to navigate the space. That makes all the difference.
Yeah. And I think too, what you're sharing, obviously, like when things are inaccessible, that takes a toll on you most of all, but it also is impacting the people that you're with, who maybe feel bad, like, shoot, I should have helped prepare you for this in advance, or like, oh God, my wife or the person I love or want to be with, my friend, isn't having a good time because of accessibility. So it does impact even people with you without disabilities too. Is that fair to say?
Oh, totally. Yeah. My best friend at the concert was just like, she has some chronic pain issues herself, but like she was really experiencing a lot of like distress because she had to do a lot of advocating because I was down so low and I couldn't talk to anybody. And so she was like, okay, you stay here. I'm going to go talk to this this security guard or this person who's standing by this gate, and had to do a lot of like just advocacy. And I know that was something she wanted to do, but I remember us sitting down and she's just like, I am exhausted. Like that was intense. And just feeling like emotional for me, like watching someone she loves have to like feel like being disrespected or not thought of. I think, it does have an impact on loved ones too. Definitely.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the final question would be, we have all of these cultural administrators here today. What tips would you like to share with them, especially thinking about smaller organizations where, it might not be possible to have everything be perfectly universally designed, but what tips would you give about making our spaces more accessible?
Yeah, I think, like you said, like universal design isn't always possible, but anytime that you're planning a space or planning an event, try to think about it from an access first perspective. I think oftentimes we can go into something and say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. This is how we want it. And then, oh, wait a minute, we have to make it accessible. And it's more of an afterthought. And we think about, okay, how do we add in a ramp, or how do we make sure we have like a special night for certain people with certain disabilities to be able to attend? But how can you really include like various bodies and minds in your design, thinking about, of course, physical access, but also sensory access, thinking about how people process information differently, and really just getting informed. I think attending events like this where you're learning and you're hearing from different people and what they go through is only going to inform your perspective and feel a little bit more empathy about what others may experience when they navigate the world. So I think just keeping disability at top of mind, and you don't even have to think about it as like disability necessarily, but just thinking about it as like human diversity, like Christina talked about. Like all of us are experiencing the world in such different ways, making sure that there are places to sit or rest if possible, spaces that folks can have quiet time if possible when you're having an event, and also just being really honest, owning the limitations that you might have. I think putting like really clear verbiage on your signage or your website about accessibility, if your space is physically inaccessible, being able to name that and offer up an alternative or at least an acknowledgement, and just a sense of self-awareness really about access. I think just to know that it's being thought about says more than anything. And I've felt seen and heard, even if I've been told like up in advance, like this might be hard for you. I think that means more to me than having to do a lot of guesswork, or going someplace where I have to then be like turned away.
Yeah. That's super helpful. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate all that you had to share, and especially that Beyonce concert, I think is going to stick with me of sort of like a series of like annoyances growing and growing, into really impacting your night. So I think that shows that, I think even with some simple things like staff training, we can really like change the course of your event, and therefore like making your day better too, right? Like it's not just about like kind of ticking a box for ADA compliance. It's more so like we want to have good experiences for everybody. And that certainly would include you and anyone else with disabilities too.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thanks for listening.
Yeah. Thanks, Bri.
Of course.
So thanks again to Bri for joining us. So that was a good way, I think, for us to focus ourselves on physical accessibility in particular as we think about our spaces, as imperfect as they might be. So let's start first with The definition of physical disability or mobility disability, you could use either interchangeably. It indicates physical limitations or disabilities that inhibit the physical function of one or more limbs of a person. It can be temporary or permanent. So thinking about, arms, legs, hands, feet, all those good limbs that we have. And then we use the word ambulatory, and Bri used that earlier too. So ambulatory is related to or adapted to walking. So Bri mentioned she considers herself kind of semi-ambulatory. So she's able to walk, she's able to get around, but like she mentioned, those situations where she might not be able to, especially longer distances or a big flight of stairs, different things like that. So some examples of physical or mobility disabilities, keeping in mind these could be acquired disabilities, meaning that we acquire them, we develop them as we go through our life, or congenital from birth conditions. So that could include cerebral palsy, spinal cord injury, amputation, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, epilepsy, temporary disabilities like recovering from a broken bone, for instance. We know that about 12% of American adults have a mobility disability, and specifically experience serious difficulty walking or climbing stairs. That's from the CDC, I think from 2 years ago. So, within that category, mobility disabilities could include hand movements and use of your hands, for instance. But this specific statistic is talking about walking up a flight of stairs, basically. So that's 12% of Americans. I would guess it's probably even higher than that if we were thinking about people like my brother Travis, for instance, who would have difficulty going up a flight of stairs like that too. So thinking about chronic pain or medical conditions that cause fatigue, that may make walking or movement more difficult. Again, as we age, we're more likely to experience a mobility disability or fatigue more easily. Remembering that, when we think about physical or mobility disabilities, I feel like the image in our mind is of a wheelchair user, but remembering that these disabilities may be invisible as well. The person might not have adaptive equipment with them. So that might, they might be missing the markers we're looking for thinking that they have a mobility related disability. And then also realizing it may be episodic in nature. If you live with multiple sclerosis and you have relapsing remitting MS, you may have days where you're perfectly fine and able to get around and be ambulatory, and then other times when you have a flare-up when you're not able to do so. So realizing what people need from day to day is likely to change as well. So related to adaptive equipment or assistive devices, so thinking about not only wheelchair users, but thinking about other folks as well, I thought it'd be helpful to know kind of what's the breakdown. So again, people may need different equipment on different days. We know from statistics that 6.8 million Americans use mobility assistive devices. So that includes 1.7 million wheelchair user or scooter riders like Bri. It also includes 6.1 million users of other mobility devices such as canes, crutches, and walkers. And you'll notice if you try to add up the 1.7 plus the 6.1, it is more than 6.8. And that is because people might use either of those things depending on the day. So realizing could have a wheelchair user today, could have somebody that's using crutches tomorrow. You'll notice as kind of we're going through this presentation so far, we've been very specific about language. And so I think sometimes language can be a big impediment for us talking about disability. So especially when we're talking about wheelchair users, you'll notice we're using the term wheelchair user or a person who uses a wheelchair. We're not using terms like confined to a wheelchair, wheelchair bound, terms like that are used a lot. It's important for us to remember that wheelchairs are providing independence. It's making it possible for people to go get to a place. They're not trapping us. They're making it possible and movement and mobility more possible. It's also important to remember that a person uses a wheelchair. So I worked at a job, not in Chicago, but in New York, where I had a boss who anytime somebody used a wheelchair cane, because our space was a little tricky accessibility wise, would shout, "We've got a wheelchair," really loudly. But hey, there was a person using a wheelchair. It wasn't just an empty wheelchair coming down on the ramp. So remembering that people use wheelchairs. So that's why we're using terms like wheelchair user or person who uses a wheelchair rather than just saying wheelchair or thinking about wheelchair seating. People use wheelchairs, so keep that in mind. The term handicapped is one that we should never be using in any situation, but you hear that word creeping up, especially when we're talking about bathrooms and we're talking about parking spaces. So instead of saying the term handicapped, we should be using the term accessible restroom or accessible parking, or you could say wheelchair accessible restroom or wheelchair accessible parking if you wanted, but accessible would be sufficient. We are also very consciously using the term disability today. There is a movement that is happening and has been happening for a few years now within the disability community that's called #SayTheWord. So not being afraid to say the word disability, really owning it as an identity, as a marginalized community, and realizing that disability is not a pejorative. So don't be afraid to say the term disability when you're talking about your different offerings. So saying the term physical disabilities is perfectly fine to say in any situation. I included at the bottom a way that you can help describe if your space is accessible. So this is in quotes, but it says, our space is accessible to guests who use wheelchairs or need to avoid stairs. So this is a great way of saying that your space is accessible to different folks, not assuming people are just using a wheelchair, but giving some information that, hey, we have an elevator or a ramp or, a way for you to get from point A to point B without having to use any stairs. So let's talk some more specifically about people with mobility or physical disabilities in cultural spaces. So I wanted to first kind of think about events or performances and thinking about how we can consider guests with these types of disabilities. So, most important, and I think probably already thinking about all of this and have this included, but making sure we are offering wheelchair accessible seating with good sight lines. And that we're following the ADA accessible ticketing requirements. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but there's a lot of very specific rules, laws about how we should be ticketing our wheelchair accessible or ADA sections or whatever you're calling it, accessible sections of our performance. We want to make sure if we do have like a general standing room only type of event, even in those cases, we should be thinking about seating in some way. We shouldn't make assumptions that people are able to stand for however long we're expecting them to stand. So if that's you have a reserved accessible section, or if that's as simple as we have some folding chairs and as we see people might need them, we're offering them up. But making sure that even for those standing room only situations, we're thinking about people that might not be able to stand for long periods of time. This is something that I meant to talk about a little bit more with Bri, but this is a great example, I think, of something that would have really helped Bri at that bar, for instance, was including a mix of low and high tables, not just having high tops. A lot of times thinking about even fundraising events or cocktail parties, we think of the high tops that have the pretty little tied tablecloth and people are standing and munching on, canapes. But realizing that, wheelchair users, people of short stature like Bri, different folks like that are not even able to access those tables. So we shouldn't be just offering one type of table. We should be offering both. So at that bar that Bri mentioned, probably, I think she said that the bar was kind of the typical height of somebody like me who's 5'4" would be able to stand at comfortably. Somebody like her would not be able to even have a conversation with the bartender. So having a lower table is super important. And having ways for your guests to be able to enjoy things at the is great. Again, we want to offer choices with chairs. Something as simple as chairs. We should be providing chairs with and without armrests. We should be offering chairs that are wider to help guests who might maybe they consider themselves fat, or maybe they use another term, but thinking about, there isn't a typical body. And so making sure that we're not offering just one type of chair, or we're not offering just one type of table. This is obvious, I think, but I'm including this in here as well. We want to have accessible entrance and accessible restrooms. I know that isn't always possible with our spaces, but wherever possible, of course, we need to be providing that. Planning for emergencies, for thinking about all guests and having them all in mind. So including guests with mobility disabilities. So if we have a fire at this event or this performance, how are we going to get the people who use wheelchairs or other adaptive equipment safely out? What's the plan for that? Have we thought about that? That should be communicated to everybody. And then also for events, especially for performances where we might have a stage, making sure that there's an accessible route for those performers with disabilities, with physical disabilities, to be able to get up to the stage. That's one that, we don't think about a lot, but certainly we would want to have representation for our performers as well. So making sure that that space is accessible as well. Thinking about exhibition spaces, we want to make sure that we really are allowing enough space to maneuver and flow. Thinking about like, what if multiple wheelchair users were visiting at once? When I worked at the Met in tighter gallery spaces, we might have a group of people who all use wheelchairs coming from, for instance, a nursing home or independent or a assistive living situation. And would we be able to all congregate at once? That was literally, a conversation we had to have and kind of measure out to see if everybody could fit. So be thinking about that. Is there space for multiple people who use wheelchairs to be able to come? I have a friend who's a wheelchair user and her husband's a wheelchair user. And she reports many times that, they're prepared to have one person who uses a wheelchair in the space, but to have two really throws everyone for a loop. So be thinking about that. Making sure both seated and standing visitors have clear sight lines. This is something, certainly that also applies to events like Bri was saying for the Beyonce concert, but thinking about our exhibitions and how we're installing works of art or artifacts on the walls and in cases, making sure, can someone who's of a shorter stature or someone who's using a wheelchair or a kid be able to see this as well as somebody who might be taller or typical height? We want to allow for flexibility for different grips of thinking about interactives that you might have, not just designing for somebody who has typical use of all 5 or 10 fingers on their hands, making sure that, they don't need to use a lot of strength to manipulate whatever interactive you have. There's something called the closed fist test. So, we can even do this in the restrooms, but making sure with a closed fist, are you able to turn on the faucet? Are you able to open the door? Are you able to flush the toilet? Are you able to access the interactive? That's an easy way to test, like, is it possible for different people with different needs to use the things that you're designing? Like Bri mentioned, I think, and like many of us know from probably visiting spaces with families, but we want to have as much seating as possible. I have a friend who's an exhibit designer who always says, like, include seating and then add some more. So be thinking about your seating and be thoughtful about it. That should never be an afterthought. Offering wheelchairs for people to borrow, both regular and wide, so that people with different bodies could use a wheelchair if they needed to. I think it's super important to at least have 1 or 2, even if you're a tiny space, just in case of emergency or in case somebody ends up needing one. It's definitely come up when I've worked in smaller institutions where suddenly we needed to have a wheelchair and, we didn't. And the consequences were pretty serious even. So I think it's really great to have that available if possible. And then checking your reach ranges for interactives. So a reach range would be like, can someone seated in a wheelchair be able to, if we're thinking about a bathroom, reach the sink, reach the soap, reach the paper towel. There are very specific reach ranges that are outlined in the ADA. And so making sure that you're following that and thinking about that, and ensuring accessibility from seated and standing heights. The accessible entrance and restroom. And if you have a gift shop, a lot of times I see like exhibits are thought of as being accessible, but then you get to the gift shop and things are crammed in so tight that if you used a wheelchair or you had somebody with a stroller, they wouldn't even be able to navigate those turns in that space. So that means you have too much stuff in there. So you need to be kind of simplifying things so that it's easier for people to maneuver. And then, of course, we also want to make sure that if you're working with artists, if you're creating like interactives, this has come up, for instance, with the Chicago Architecture Biennial, when architects and designers are designing these awesome, sometimes interactive spaces that people can pass through, making sure that those are accessible. So we don't want, especially where it's not necessary. Why do we need 2 steps to lead into this like make this mock house that you're creating when we could easily have a ramp, for instance. Thinking about that as well. Something that I talk about a lot, and this is just a name that I came up with, but I think it really summarizes what I'd like you all to be doing and what it's important for us to do. It's called a statement of welcome. So we want to make sure we're making it really clear for people about our events or about our exhibitions or performances, about the accessibility and what people need to know about it. So like Bri mentioned, folks with disabilities often are doing a lot of advanced legwork, or loved ones of people with disabilities are doing all this legwork to prepare for an event. So let's make it simple for them. So first of all, we're going to say like guests with disabilities are welcome. So as we're kind of framing all of this, we want this to be both welcoming in tone and also informational. We want it to be both. So first we want to let you know, like, we want you to be here. And so saying something as simple as like, our organization is committed to welcoming everyone to whatever this is that you're inviting them to. If you are providing access services, like for today, we're providing open captioning, or rather closed captioning for the event. We would say we're providing closed captioning with a real-time captioner for this event. If it wasn't a space that's accessible, I would say, you know, our space is accessible to wheelchair users and guests who need to avoid stairs. And then I'm also, most importantly, including a way for people to contact us if they need more information or need to request something else. So I'm saying to request another access service or learn more, contact email address or phone number. I think having both is really important, again, to be as accessible as possible with as much advance notice as you can. So we can't, by law, tell people you have to tell us 2 weeks in advance or else. You can put in like a suggested time frame, but I like to just say as far in advance as possible, let us know. And making it possible for people to have a conversation if they need to, thinking about those folks that might have multiple disabilities and might need to ask you some questions about X, Y, or Z. That way they have a way to do that. Of course, we want to make sure that that whoever's answering the phone or checking that email address is knowledgeable, or it's getting to the person who is more knowledgeable about access at your organization. So it's not just being checked by somebody who doesn't know anything about this, and then the answer is always probably going to be no from these people. We want to make sure it's going to somebody who knows more, or at least you don't have to know all the answers, but you at least know where to go if you have questions, and you're not going to tell someone no right off the bat. So describing our accessibility is so important, like Bri mentioned. So I think having information, not only are we putting the statement of welcome for different events in our email, you know, our email invitation to an event, we're going to put that statement of welcome. We also need to have information about our accessibility on our website and in our collateral material. Again, not assuming, you know, that the typical visitor that we might have to our space is going to be somebody who doesn't have a disability. We rather should be assuming that it is someone with a disability. So let's put everything out there that we offer and making it clear. So I think it's really important to have an accessibility tab on your website, making it super obvious where people can go and get more information, and then including that in, you know, the calendar you're sending out to your members or different things like that. It's really important, I think, especially on the website, to be really specific about information to help guests make informed decisions. So a lot of organizations, for instance, theaters, include the dimensions of the seats. So making it possible for people with disabilities, as well as people who might identify as being fat, making it really possible for them to know, like, how big are the seats? Will I need to request something else? Will this work for me? We want to make sure that we're giving as much info upfront so people can decide, you know, I do want to go to this or I don't want to go to this. And then I think this last point is so important, and I hope is something that you all take away from today, if nothing else, which is if there's an aspect of your space that is not accessible, especially not physically accessible, acknowledge that and be specific about it. So for instance, saying our entrance has one small 6-inch step up and our door width is 36 inches. So making it clear, like, this is what it's like if you want to get into the space, or, you know, most of the exhibition is accessible except for this part, or, you know, kind of describing those pieces is so important. I think people are afraid to own up and put into writing the fact that something is not accessible. And I get that, we kind of want to keep it on the DL because it's, something we're probably ashamed of or we wish was better. But by putting it out there, like Bri's saying, you're going to be saving people a lot of disappointment potentially. And you're providing them information to help them make their choices. They're going to find out your space is not accessible. And I would much rather they know that from the beginning rather than, later. So I think this is much better than just saying like, our space is not accessible for wheelchair users. That isn't very specific, but rather it's important to say, these are the facts. These are the dimensions. Our bathroom has, a sink that's 60 inches high or whatever, so that you're making it clear so people kind of know what they're getting into. This is an example I wanted to share that just happened a couple of months ago to a friend that I have. She shared this on Facebook. I have her okay to share this. It is at a venue in Chicago. I won't name it. Maybe some of you might know what this venue is, but I'll read this to you. We were supposed to be at a concert tonight, but after arranging ADA accommodations in advance, we arrived early as requested, only to be told the quote accommodations we arranged involved being carried up flights of stairs. What? We were told ramps would be in place, but nothing about being carried. Their website also says nothing about being carried either. Being carried in my $50,000 custom wheelchair is not an accommodation. It is a liability for your staff and for me and for my expensive medical device. Just say you're not accessible. We've been doing this for 40 years, ... is in quotes. Needless to say, this was perplexing. You could sit in the lobby and listen to music. It was also in quotes. No thanks. I have more dignity than that. We got our money back, except not, because we bought them on StubHub, so they refunded some guy named Kyle. Being disabled is exhausting. It doesn't need to be this hard. So, and I have this under hashtag access fail. So this is a huge access fail. I think she even describes in this what would have been so helpful for her to know, which is the fact that, you can come to the concert, but we're going to carry you up the stairs. That obviously is not ideal. It might work for some people and it might not work for other people. And so we need to be super clear with folks what you're going to be doing, what you're offering, so that people can decide. So it sounds like they had this, back and forth interaction where this was never shared. Certainly this should be on the website, and especially should have been shared as you're talking individually with the guest about kind of the plan for the event and what's going to be happening. So this is a huge fail. And this happened in 2023. So again, own where your access shortcomings are. It doesn't excuse the fact, that it isn't an accessible space. It's not going to necessarily save you from a lawsuit, but it's probably going to really develop goodwill between you and the potential guests that you have. The person, if they know the information up front, is going to be a lot less upset than if they get there for that event all ready and, the expectations super high for the event. And then to be told that, this isn't what they thought it was going to be is very upsetting. So again, add your statement of welcome where you can for all of your events, any communication you're sending out. If you have a, flyer about, the upcoming show you have or the upcoming exhibit you have, including a statement of welcome or, even just the email address and phone number for access accommodations is super helpful. I like to suggest that you avoid the term ADA to describe accessibility. Bri mentioned, for the Beyonce show, for instance, there was the ADA seating. ADA is a legal term, not an identity. And also compliance is the bare minimum. So there's a great expression we say in the disability community, ADA is the floor, not the ceiling. So let's not use the term ADA. Let's say guests with disabilities or accessibility seating. I think that is a much clearer way to describe it. And also keeping in mind, ADA is, an acronym that not everyone's familiar with, especially if we have international guests. So I think it's a lot clearer to say accessibility or to say guests with disabilities for your area of seating or whatever you're providing. If you do have inaccessible entrances, but there are other accessible offerings, make sure you have signage at the inaccessible spots about how to get to the accessible spots, so that making it really easy for people to get around. That would have been super helpful for Bri at the Beyonce show to have had that. if you're creating a map or you have, some sort of layout that you're sharing with folks about how to get from point A to point B, make sure that you're also sharing the accessible routes of how to get from point A to point B, and pointing out where the accessible restrooms are and different accessibility information in that kind of general publication or part of your website that you have. And then also, if there is a problem with access that day, what if your elevator breaks or, the bathroom's out of order, the accessible bathroom's out of order, making sure you're using social media and your website to update people about this, or email ticket holders if you know who's coming so that they know, as well as posting signage day of. And I'll share with you now an example of where this was another access fail. This just happened, I think like a month ago for Senator Tammy Duckworth. I'm sharing a screen grab from Politico of Senator Duckworth, and the headline is "Senator Tammy Duckworth's Barbie Moment Cut Short. A broken elevator kept the Barbie-loving senator who uses a wheelchair from seeing the show." And I included this quote from the article here. Sorry, it's a little long, but it summed it up perfectly. So wherever she goes, Duckworth, or like she always does, it's cut off, of course I can't see it. Wherever she goes, Duckworth checked to make sure the theater was wheelchair accessible. It was upon arrival. She learned, though, that the theater's elevator was broken. There was no way for Duckworth to get to the show. The Illinois senator was frustrated that there had been no signage explaining the problem and that little support was offered from theater staff about the situation. Duckworth sent her daughters and friends up to the show while she waited outside for them to return. And then I think this paragraph is kind of the most damning here, which is, "I missed out on an experience with my girls," Duckworth said. "I'm pretty tough about these things, but this one really was a little bit of a stab to my soul." So, elevators break, technology malfunctions, but we need to be communicating with people in advance, again, so that their expectations aren't so high. I think I read in a different article that the senator got all dressed up with her girls, wearing all pink to go see the Barbie show together with friends, and they're all ready to go. And then she finds out that she can't go with them. That's kind of a double blow. So trying to own those problems and being upfront is really important. So like we talked about with Beyonce, I'm saying Beyonce more than I ever have in my life, but that's fun. So like we learned with Beyonce, we want to train staff and volunteers. We want to make sure they know accessible routes, that they know about options and policies. Everybody should know that, or at least be able to quickly find that information or find that point person if they need to. We also want to make sure staff and volunteers really know that we want to welcome all guests regardless of abilities. If you have a tricky space accessibility wise, we don't want, the volunteer staff member that's at the front desk to kind of look really downtrodden that there's a wheelchair user who arrives, not because they're sad to see the wheelchair user, but because they're sad, this is a bad situation, oh no. We want to make sure that people feel welcome and that we're being really clear about what access offerings we have. Having an access point person is so important. If you're attending today, that's probably you, whether or not it's in your job title, but making sure that there is one person that you can direct staff or volunteers to that can help to address questions. It doesn't mean you know everything, like I said, but it does mean you know enough to do some research or do some digging, or, most importantly, that not to say no right off the bat to whatever someone requests. So making sure that our staff and volunteers know, don't say no if somebody asks for something that, they're unfamiliar with. A great example, I think, is a guest that, maybe you have a policy of no food or drink, but you have a guest who has some type of disability that requires them, maybe they're tube fed, so they need to bring in their specialized food with them, or they're diabetic, so they always need to travel with some type of sugar with them, or different things like that. So that would be, we could simply make a modification to that policy for that guest, because that is required under the ADA, and also what we want to do to help people feel welcome. So, maybe you have this policy, but we want to make sure that, if somebody asks for something we're not sure of, that they know that staff member or volunteer knows who to turn to ask more questions. So again, this is about the food, I think, as a good example, but share that, there might be situations we do have these policies, but sometimes we have to be flexible depending on what guests need. Christina, will help make that decision for you in the moment. So if you're not sure, just come call me and I will be able to address it. Or, if you want to empower your guests in or your staff and volunteers in some situations, then say, we have this policy, but there might be times when people might, need to not follow it, and you're allowed to do X, Y, or Z if you need to at your discretion. So making it more possible for them to kind of make a decision in that moment so that they're not discriminating and excluding someone. And then again, make sure everybody knows about your emergency planning and that you're thinking about people with all types of disabilities, but especially, emergency egress is really important to consider people with physical disabilities. So really quick, accessible ticketing basics. We want to ensure that there's equity in our ticketing policies so that basically patrons with disabilities have the same opportunities to purchase and use their tickets as those without disabilities. And the second point is super important. So provide patrons with the ability to purchase accessible seats through the same means and in the same manner as is available to people without. So if you have accessible seats for your performance, but you only have it available, people have to call, but then somebody without a disability can buy them online, that would be violating the ADA. So you want to make sure that you are following the accessible ticketing policies. I know we're kind of running short on time, so I'm going to skip the rest of this, but I will include a link for you all so you can learn more about accessible ticketing if you don't already. So thinking a little bit about funding, access costs money. I recognize that. And so we want to make sure that we have we're incorporating access where we can. So a capital campaign is so important, or applying for a grant. If there is a grant that's focused on diversity or diversity, equity, and inclusion, disability is a part of that. So perhaps those upgrades could be included. There might be local service organizations. For instance, the Lions Club Rotary donated an accessible pottery wheel when I worked at an art center here in Chicago. So connecting with those folks that might already be servicing people with disabilities. ComEd Powering the Arts Grant for those of us in Chicago, that's another one that might make sense. Or individual donors, especially people that might have a connection to disability, that might be a good place to start. Contacting your city government about grants for physical upgrades. Lifeline Theater, a small theater here in Chicago, had a gala that focuses specifically on fundraising for accessibility. So make it a whole event. You might have, I think access is a sexy thing, and people know that it costs money to provide these things. And so put it front and center. This shouldn't be something that you're hiding. Maybe you're focusing your Giving Tuesday efforts on fundraising for access. And then if you are renting in an accessible space, I know that can happen, so if you do have a space that maybe with some small upgrades, like a ramp or remodeling a restroom, it could be accessible, then maybe you can try to require an upgrade in your negotiations. So I'd suggest, getting a bid or estimate so you know how much it would cost, and consulting with a guest or somebody with a disability. And then there's also a checklist that I'll include in the end that you could just take a look at to make sure you're following. But maybe you would negotiate in your lease negotiations, like, hey, we know the space isn't accessible, but we could add 2 extra years to our lease if you could make the space accessible by, 2025. So try to work that into your negotiations where you can. There are tax incentives available for for-profit spaces. So if you're renting from a business, there could be ways that they could help pay for those upgrades or get tax credits, so it wouldn't have an impact on them in the same way. If any remodeling or upgrades are happening, if this includes if you own your space or if you're renting a space, but if you're doing any remodeling, then by law, you need to make sure you're making it accessible, because the argument is if you have the money to do these upgrades, then you have the money to make it accessible. So keep that in mind. So, if your landlord's upgrading the bathroom, but choosing not to make it accessible, that would be a violation of the ADA. And then also looking at perhaps your neighborhood chamber of commerce. Sometimes they might have some incentives or ways that, maybe you could bundle with another member of a chamber of commerce or something so that you could go in together. I'll share this whole PowerPoint with you all, but there are some tax incentives, like I mentioned. So this is included here. And so you can read more about that as well. And I wanted to share two examples about spaces or about organizations rather in Chicago that have found really smart ways to deal with inaccessible spaces. So first is the Chicago Humanities Festival, which is a huge festival that happens in the fall where they go to, I think, like 60 different venues where they have speakers and do all sorts of different things. They go all across the city. And in the past, they would go, anywhere. They'd be going to churches, they'd be going to all these different spaces. And some of these spaces were not accessible. And so they very consciously said, from this date forward, we're only going to be booking spaces that are accessible. So that should be a part, if you have the luxury of deciding where your space is or where your event's going to be taking place, bare minimum, you should be choosing a space that is accessible. But if you are like the neo-futurists here in Chicago, they have a space that's up a flight of stairs. And they're super tiny organization. They rent their space. They, their hands are tied right now with what they can do. So one of the workarounds that they found was that they partnered with Steppenwolf Theater Company, and then once a year would provide an accessible performance in Steppenwolf's accessible space. So, they acknowledge most of the time they're not able to accommodate people who can't go up a flight of stairs, but this is their workaround. So at the very least, they're providing this event in an accessible space, and they're partnering with community partners to help promote it so people actually know about it and show up for it. So this is a list of resources that I'll be sharing. We've got an awesome checklist that is going to outline those specific measurements, which is so important. And it's really broken down, and I think in a really helpful way. I have it printed off and in a binder. I'd suggest checking that out. The Smithsonian has a guideline for accessible exhibitions, which is really great. I have a link for the accessible ticketing requirements. The Great Lakes ADA Center is a great resource where you can ask technical questions if you need support. The Kennedy Center has an awesome conference that's happening I think next week. That's called the LEAD Conference. So that is a great way to learn more. I'm including in this presentation the Accessible Icon Project. So this is the really preferred image or icon to use when we're talking about physical accessibility, which is called like the active wheelchair user one, where it looks like somebody's actually rolling themselves rather than the typical icon you might see where somebody's just seated and like stationary. So you can download that for free and utilize that in your collateral material. And in Chicago, there's something called Chicago Ramp Share, where you could borrow a ramp for a period of time if you needed one. So that's something else to check out. So I've been talking a lot. We have a little bit of time for some questions. So Abby, would you mind? I see there's some stuff in the chat. Would you want to ask a couple questions?
Thank you so much, Christina. This has all been so helpful. And yeah, we have about 5 minutes left. So just wondering that really what's been happening in the chat is just everyone being grateful and thank you for this information. But if anybody wants to throw a question up in the chat, I can read it. Or if you want to unmute and ask, that's great too. Does anybody have anything that came up that they're wondering about? I think the thing that has been so great is just really paying attention to being intentional with your language and the information that you're providing, especially on your websites. I know so many small arts organizations often don't have the capacity or don't have their own space. And so doing these minor shifts in the way that we're approaching access, I think is so important. So I really appreciate you highlighting that. And I think I'm getting a lot of people in the chat just saying thank you. And is it possible to put the links from the last slide in the chat? Someone asked.
I don't know. Let's see if I have it. Let's see if I can. But at the very least, I did already send the presentation to you, Abby, so you can pass it on to everyone. So it is linked there. So because I have like the hyperlinks with the names, I don't think it's working to put the direct links in at this time.
Yes. And I will, I'll be sharing the presentation that Christena used today. And I will also send out the YouTube link as well once we've got it posted. And also, I just want to remind everyone that this is the first presentation training in a series of 3 that we're partnering with Christena on. So if you loved this and are interested in learning more, our next one is on September 14th. We're going to be focusing on accessibility for deaf and hard of hearing audiences. And then mid-October, October 12th, we'll be focusing on accessibility for blind and low vision audiences. So, you know, really appreciate Christena today focusing in on physical disability accessibility, but this is just the first of a couple conversations. So I'm excited to continue the conversation over the next couple months. And, you know, if questions do arise from anyone, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. As Christena mentioned at the beginning of her presentation, she also loves to get emails. So you can reach out to either of us. And she also just dropped her email in the chat. So last chance, any last thoughts or questions from anyone, or Christena, anything?
I don't think so, other than it's my pleasure. Thanks for listening to me. Hopefully I didn't talk too fast. But as you can tell, I love talking about this topic. It's so important. And, you know, if you have individualized questions, I know everyone's space is so different. And you know, I also know firsthand being a cultural administrator means you're got lots of hats that you're wearing. So feel free to reach out with specific questions or different things, and I'll answer it or try to direct you to other folks or connect you to other people too. So, you know, we're all in this together, and we're never going to be, you know, perfectly accessible all of the time, but we can always strive to be better.
Thank you, Christena. And also, I just want to shout out again, thank you to Bri Beck for joining us and telling us about her own personal experiences. I also want to thank Kyle Hammond of KBH Media for the working on the back end to make sure that this was all possible. And also Jamie Camasso of SignNexus for helping provide us with captions today. So thank you to all of you for showing up and being here to listen and learn. We really appreciate your time. We know that your time is precious as small arts leaders. So we can't thank you enough for being here on this journey with us. And we hope to see you in September and October. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. So thanks, everyone. Appreciate you.